Today I'm going to show you how to make a pillowcase. For this you are going to need 2 pieces of fabric that will have already been cut for you. You will have one larger piece and one that is a little bit skinnier. Now they are both going to be used. What I am doing is a little bit of a scaled down version of what you'll be making, just so that I can see it all within the camera lens. So I'm first going to take my smaller fabric and I'm going to open it up completely. I want to be looking at the pretty side. I'm not sure if the camera can tell this, but this has a little bit of glitter on it. So I'm going to keep that pretty side up. If you have a solid color, it doesn't really matter which direction it's going. So I'm going to lay that down, and then I'm going to take my bigger fabric and I'm going to open that up. And I'm going to match that along the top edge of this fabric. Now, if you have extra hanging off the sides, or if your main fabric is bigger and it's longer, that's okay. We can fix that in another step. Now you're going to pin these 2 layers together along the very top. You want them to be even, so if you turn it over onto the other side, there isn't one side that's drastically longer than the other. You're going to need about 8 pins. Again, mine's a little bit smaller, so I'm not going to use quite 8. But you're going to pin them together, and to do that you want to pinch all the layers of your fabric together, and then you're going to stab your pin through the pinch there and just allow it to stay flat. Sometimes students will just poke their pin through. That does not hold it in place, so if you move it, it comes out, versus the one that's stuck together. That secures it a little bit more. So again, I'm just going to pinch, stab my pinch. And you want to put your pins about 4 or 5 inches apart, all the way across. Now it's time for the next step on your pillowcase. This step may seem very strange and not quite sure how it'll turn into a pillowcase, but I promise you it's gonna work. What I'm gonna do is, as I have it laid out with my cuff fabric underneath and the top pinned, I'm gonna take the bottom edge of my fabric and I'm going to start rolling it up into basically one big long tube. When I get it to about the middle of my cuff fabric, I'm going to take that cuff fabric and I'm going to do what we call the burrito method. So we have our burrito filling and we want to keep that filling in the middle. And as we wrap it, that filling again is staying in the middle, and I'm going to bring it up to the top. And I want to now match up all 3 layers of fabric. So my outside layers are white, my inside layer is black. I want all of them to be right even with each other. I'm going to take out the pin and replace it with the extra layer of fabric in there. So I make it match up, pinch it, put the pin in, and I will replace all my pins so that it now has 3 layers of fabric. Now sometimes we think we get all the layers together, but I want you to just turn it over. Just make sure everything is lining up. This side isn't matched up perfectly. You would probably be okay with it, but I'm gonna make sure that it is right on. All right, now we are ready to sew. Now that I'm ready to sew, I have my machine threaded and I have both my top thread and my bobbin thread going towards the back of the machine. I'm ready to put my fabric underneath my presser foot. Now you can see here, as I open it up, the black fabric starts a few inches after the white fabric does. So I'm going to use that as my starting point. Now, as we put it under the machine, it's important to look at the lines on the needle stitch plate. The middle two lines have indicators of where you need to be starting. The back line indicates where your fabric should be when you start. The front line indicates where your needle is going to go down into the fabric. You want to line the side of your fabric up with that 5/8 inch mark. That's going to be our main point that we're looking at as we sew. Always be watching that 5/8 inch line and steering your fabric so that it stays against that to have a straight line as you sew. Please remember to put your presser foot down. Many people forget, and that creates a lot of problems. I can still feel in my fabric my filling of my burrito over here. I want to keep that free of where my needle's going. I'm going to start by back stitching, so that means I'm going to go forward about 3 to 5 stitches. Then I'm going to push and hold my reverse button, again 3 to 5 stitches. That's going to lock your stitches into place. Then I can let go, and now I'm going to sew the rest of my pillowcase along that seam. When I come close to having a pin, I don't want to sew over a pin. Please take them out and set them on the counter next to you. Don't set them on the machine or underneath the machine, as they get lost and sometimes find their way into the inner workings of the machine, and that doesn't really work well. So as I sew, I'm going to keep it along that 5/8 inch line. Notice both of my hands are up here steering the fabric. The rest of the tube is kind of just hanging down in front. I just need to make sure that I'm steering whatever is going on down here under the needle to make sure it's always along that 5/8 inch line. Stop when you get to a pin. Okay, that was my final pin, and I'm getting to the end of my fabric. When I get to the end of where the black and white meet, I'm going to back stitch at that point as well. 3 to 5 stitches and the end. If yours actually goes off the end, you can go off the end of your fabric. When you have finished sewing that line, lift up your presser foot and you can pull your fabric and thread out from the machine. Ideally, you'll be able to use the thread cutter that's on the side of it to cut it loose. If that one isn't available or it's not working, just make sure that you are cutting those thread tails nice and short on the beginning and the end. Always give your seam a haircut right after it's sewn so that those threads are out of the way. Now that I have my fabric sewn, the next step is a little tricky, but just kind of go with me on it. I'm going to take my fabric of what is my cuff fabric, and I'm just going to put my fingers in the outside of it. I don't want to grab any part that right now that is that main fabric. And I'm going to turn this down kind of like I'm turning down a sock, just rolling down the outside edge of it. And as I do that, the insides are coming out now. This is good. This is what we want to have happen. You're going to take one hand and leave it on the outside edge of your cuff, and you're going to just kind of work it around, making sure that as you pull out the insides, you're going to be doing that at the same time. You're pulling in both directions, that it's not just one being pulled, the other one then will get all jammed up, and it makes it really hard. We're going to need to pull out the entire inside from here. Now, as you do this, if you are hearing any kind of stretching, cracking, or breaking of thread or fabric, you're doing it wrong. So you may want to ask your teacher or a neighbor for help as you do this. So we're almost all the way out. There we go. Just make sure all the parts are out of there. Okay, then we can unroll it and our next step is to go over to the irons. Now that I have my cuff pulled out, everything is turned right side out, I need to press this cuff fabric right here. It remembers when it laid flat, but we don't want it to lay flat anymore. We have it folded in several areas. There's going to be a crease right here, a crease at the top, and a crease on the back side. So to set those creases and make them nice and sharp, we're going to use an iron and we're going to press it. Now when we press, I have a spray bottle nearby, we are just going to lightly mist the fabric. That just helps to relax the fabric, and so when it forms into that new crease, it'll be nice and flat. I'm going to just slightly push my fabric over the white cuff fabric so that it lays flat. And I'm going to hold that iron there for about 3 seconds. And I'm just going to work my way across the entire top of this side of the fabric. You don't need a whole lot of water with it. Just enough to create a little bit of steam is all that you'll need. And you're going to go across the top. Now we have that nice and flat. Now I need to turn it over and I need to do the same thing to the other side. As I did that, sometimes I created a crease not exactly where I want it to. Right here I can lift up the fabric and I can see that there's some gap right here. So I'm going to do the same thing again. Spray this side with a light mist. And if you need to pull up that fabric so that it lays flat, go ahead and do so. As you move your iron around, you don't want to be sliding it back and forth. You want to put it on top, hold it, actually press it like a button. A button you press, you don't rub a button back and forth. That's going to help it to stay flat and not stretch out of place, and then you'll have a wonky looking pillowcase. I'm going to go ahead and crease the top of the fabric so that it also lays flat. Notice that between the times that I move it, I'm picking up my iron. I'm not just gliding it. There we go. We're ready for the next step. Now that we've done our ironing, the next step is to cut off any extras that we may have. I'm just going to take a pair of scissors and just carefully, trying to make that line completely straight, cut off any extra that you may have. If you have to go down the entire side of your fabric, that's fine too. Hopefully you aren't cutting off a ton. Sometimes fabric will even have what we call a selvage, and that is just the edge of your fabric that is made so it doesn't fray, and it's how they use it in the factories when they're weaving it. They need it a little bit stronger on the edges of the fabric so that it can hold on to the rollers that they use. Go ahead and cut off that selvage. It tends to behave a little bit differently. Typically when we sew, we don't use that because when you wash it, sometimes it shrinks at a different rate than the other parts of your fabric. All right, for our next step, we're going to take the pillowcase and fold it in half. Now, if you have a print, you want the print on the inside, pretty sides together. So we're going to put right sides together, and at this point, so I have folded it in half, and this side has my fold. I'm going to pin along two sides. So this one, you want to make sure that your seam up here matches pretty close. Ideally, we would have things that just are even all the way around, and you're still going to do that same pinching method of pinch the edge and stab through that pinch. And we're going to do that all the way around. Make sure that your edges are lined up. If they are not lined up, make them line up. Not by cutting, but actually pick up your fabric and move it. So I hardly ever actually just trust the fabric that it's going to do what I want it to. I'm going to trust that the fabric is going to do exactly opposite of what I want it to do. So I have to be checking it all the time. I like to have the pins go towards the inside of the fabric, so that way if I have to grab it, I'm not grabbing a pin that's going to stab me. It's going to be a little bit safer. And when the pins are just barely hanging off of the edge right there, I find it makes it easier when I'm sewing to grab them and pull them out rather than having to reach over to the other side. I'm right-handed, so it makes it a little bit easier when I'm sewing. All right, now that we have all of this pinned, I'm going to start up here at the top and back stitch. I'm going to again keep my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to go all the way down, and I'm going to pivot at the corner. We have practiced pivoting. This is where you put your needle down into your fabric, lift up the presser foot, and that allows you to rotate it into a new direction. And then I'm going to sew right off to the edge of this one, but I'll back stitch before I finish. So back stitching at the beginning and the end, pivot at the corner.